Good morning. It is Tuesday, June the 18th, and this is The Drill. Thank you very much. My name is Ronald T. Hartgrove. This is my podcast called The Drill, and it's about being a true conservative and the difference between being a true conservative and being a reactionary or a traditionalist. And it's also about what true conservatism is and why it matters. My podcast is made possible by Spreaker.com. It can be heard on iTunes and Spotify, among others. And my email address is storytimes@hotmail.com. I am on Twitter at Ronald Hartgrove and on Facebook at The Drill. Being a true conservative is knowing that the essence of any argument is change. Where you stand on change is where you stand politically. If it ain't broke, don't fix it is conservative. And if it ain't broke, break it is socialist. If it ain't broke, it ain't my fault is reactionary. True conservatism is not merely a political identity, but a philosophical reality. So what is being conserved besides the status quo? Individuality. The rights enumerated in the Constitution are individual rights, not human rights, not white rights, not men's rights, not straight rights, because there are no group rights. The true conservative thinks as an individual for and about individuals. By conceding the word we, the reactionary allows himself to be trapped into groupthink, inadvertently promoting the very thing that he claims to despise, a bloated, overreaching bureaucracy. As a result, the left appears to win again and again. A word about the left. They have no authority. They have no power. They can't win. The only reason that they appear to win is that conservatives give them their victories. Conservatives, especially talk show hosts, aid and abet the left. The biggest mistake that so-called conservative talk show hosts make is being reactionary. Being reactionary is an anti-conceptual mentality that involves reacting to arbitrary claims and aping the left. Arbitrary claims are those claims that lack evidence or proof. Aping the left means copying their communications style, which means making predictions and using anti-concepts. Making predictions deprives conservatives of values by substituting forecasting for moralizing. Moralizing involves judgment, and judgment is used to decide ultimately what is real and what is imaginary. We use judgment instead of prediction because we need to answer the question, what should I do? Not, what is going to happen? Using anti-concepts aids the left in obliterating legitimate concepts, such as property and conflict of interest. The second biggest mistake pundits make is in confusing traditionalism with conservatism. Traditionalism demands a slavish devotion to the status quo, and traditionalism is a mistake because it is as idealistic as socialism. The socialist tells himself, if we could only get rid of the status quo, we'd be all set. The traditionalist tells himself, if only we could get rid of change, we'd be all set. If it is true that imitation is the sincerest form of flattery, then right-wing pundits do more to honor the left than to defeat it. And that's my introduction to my podcast. And today I'm going to be again covering Idris Shah, The Tales of the Dervishes, When the Waters Were Changed, where I'm going to be reading from the concept of the day from the Ayn Rand lexicon, and also an entry from the Conservative Dictionary, and thank you, Siri, or whatever your name is. And anyway, so I'm going to be reading Idris Shah, Tales of the Dervishes, and When the Waters Were Changed, the concept of the day from the Ayn Rand lexicon, an entry from the Conservative Dictionary, and I'm also going to be reading from Ben Shapiro's Bullies, the book on left-wing bullies and how they silence Americans. And also, I'm going to be reading from The Reactionary Mind. So, all that when I come back. Thank you. Welcome back. When the waters were changed. Once upon a time, Kadir, the teacher of Moses, called upon mankind with a warning. At a certain date, he said, all the water in the world which had not been specially hoarded would disappear. It would then be renewed with different water which would drive men mad. Only one man listened to the meaning of this advice. He collected water and went to a secure place where he stored it and waited for the water to change its character. On the appointed date, the stream stopped running, the wells went dry, and the man who had listened, seeing this happening, went to his retreat and drank his preserved water. When he saw from his security the waterfalls again beginning to flow, this man descended among the other sons of men. He found that they were thinking and talking in an entirely different way from before, yet they had no memory of what had happened, nor of having been warned. When he tried to talk to them, he realized that they thought that he was mad, and they showed hostility or compassion, not understanding. At first he drank none of the new water, but went back to his concealment to draw on his supplies every day. Finally, however, he took the decision to drink the new water because he could not bear the loneliness of living, behaving, and thinking in a different way from everyone else. He drank the new water and became like the rest. Then he forgot all about his own store of special water, and his fellows began to look upon him as a madman who had miraculously been restored to sanity. And this reflects a lot of what's going on in the country today. Some sums it up, basically. But that what the left is trying to do is apply social pressure to the people on the right, isolate them, get them to become people, conservatives, people on the right, get them to be so lonely that they would rather switch than fight, so to speak. So that was When the Waters Were Changed, and I'll be back in a minute. Thank you very much. And the concept of the day today is from the Ayn Rand lexicon is goal-oriented action, or goal-directed action, Only a living entity can have goals or can originate them, and it is only a living organism that has the capacity for self-generated goal-directed action. On the physical level, the functions of all living organisms, from the simplest to the most complex, from the nutritive function in the single cell of the amoeba, to the blood circulation in the body of a man, are actions generated by the organism itself and directed to a single goal, the maintenance of the organism's life. When applied to physical phenomena such as the automatic functions of an organism, the term goal-directed is not to be taken to mean purposive, a concept directly applicable only to the actions of a consciousness, and it is not to imply the existence of any teleological principle operating in insentient nature. I use the term goal-directed in this context to designate the fact that the automatic functions of living organisms are actions whose nature is such that they result in the preservation of an organism's life. And that was goal-directed action, the concept of the day from the Ayn Rand lexicon. So now we're going to move to the Conservative Dictionary, and the entry of the day is called Club of Rome. Club of Rome, a neo-Malthusian group of world socialists formed in 1968 in Bellagio, Italy, under the auspices of David Rockefeller and currently headquartered in Windhoek, Switzerland. The Club of Rome attempts to influence world affairs by offering advice to heads of state and other influential people throughout the world. In the early 1960s, the Club of Rome predicted massive overpopulation and starvation based on the steep increase in the birth rate at the time, which was actually a normal recovery from an abnormal drop in the birth rate in the late 50s. Needless to say, their dire predictions were never realized. And that was Club of Rome from the Conservative Dictionary. Back in a minute. Thank you. Welcome back. So before I get to the other items that I'm going to be reading, the A Reactionary Mind and Bullies, I wanted to go ahead and deal with some issues in the newspaper, in the Washington Times in particular, because I want to show a difference between the way typically right-wing pundits handle the news and the way they should handle the news. So this particular article is from the policy section of the Washington Times online. So, and the headline is "Climate Talks Held as Arctic Ice Melts, Concerns Grow." So let's see. This is done because normally I wouldn't expect to read a headline like that in the Washington Times, which bills itself as more fair. It has a tendency to be less left-leaning much less left-leaning than the Washington Post or the New York Times. So there's a picture of a protest, and in the lower part of the picture there is a banner that 15 or 20 people are holding, and the words read "Act Now." And on the right side, from the viewer's perspective, "Extinction Rebellion." And what the most noteworthy thing about it is a symbol over on the left side as the viewer is looking at it. And then there's some flags with the same symbol on it. And the symbol looks like a stylized hourglass in a circle. But what it immediately reminded me of was the Nazis. I mean, the left and the Nazis were left because they're idealist. The Nazis were idealist. And so therefore they were part of the left, because the left is idealist. The right is realist. Anyhow, so they love their symbols. The left, they just love their symbols. Nazis love their symbols. They have their swastikas and other symbols. And the left, Antifa, has its symbol, an A in a circle, and this group has its symbol, I'm assuming it's supposed to be an hourglass. It looks like two triangles, one on top of another, and in a circle. So, in black and white. So again, and the colors black and white have a kind of a Nazi connotation to them. And the caption for this particular picture reads, in this Tuesday, April 23rd, 2019 file photo, climate change protesters march along Whitehall toward Parliament in London. So apparently it's an English protest, and again, English people that have come up with this Act Now fascistic organization, a fascistic or Nazistic, National Socialistic organization. So this is a piece written by Frank Jordans of the Associated Press, and it was written yesterday. From Berlin, diplomats and climate experts gathered Monday in Germany for UN-hosted talks on climate change amid growing public pressure for governments to act faster against global warming. Officials meeting in the western city of Bonn for the June 17 to 27 talks are focusing on resolving issues that couldn't be agreed upon at last December's climate summit in Poland. This includes the rules governing the international trade in carbon certificates, which allow rich countries to offset emissions by paying for projects in poor nations. The talks are taking place against a backdrop of mounting concerns about global warming that have been heightened by extreme weather events and other signs that man-made climate change may already be leaving its mark on the planet. Over the weekend, a picture taken by Danish climate researchers showing sled dogs on the ice in northern Greenland with their paws in melted ice water was widely shared on social media. Greenland's ice melting season normally runs from June to August, but the Danish Meteorological Institute said this year's melting started on April 30th, the second earliest time on record going back to 1980. Students in Europe and beyond have staged regular street protests demanding leaders do more to meet the 2015 Paris Accords goal of keeping average temperature increases below 2 degrees Celsius, 3.6 Fahrenheit. Ideally, 1.5 degrees Celsius or 2.7 degrees Fahrenheit by the end of the century compared to pre-industrial times. While experts discuss technical issues in Bonn, European Union leaders will be debating the 28 nations' long-term strategy on climate change Thursday in Brussels. German Chancellor Angela Merkel has indicated that she backs proposals to stop adding further greenhouse gas emissions to the atmosphere by 2050, a move that will require ending almost all fossil fuel use by then. Britain, Germany, and France are expected to pass national legislation this year enshrining this net zero target in law. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres has invited world leaders to outline their country's efforts to cut greenhouse gas emissions on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly in September. They'll likely face no let-up in pressure there. It goes on, but then I get into Miss Greta Thunberg, a 16-year-old Swedish activist. Let me see. I don't know, maybe this is worth reading after all. Let's give it a shot here. Greta Thunberg, a 16-year-old Swedish activist who has inspired the student protests and harangued the global elite in Davos and elsewhere, has announced she will take a year off from high school to attend the New York Summit and the UN's annual climate meeting being held this year in Chile. The tricky thing is that it's on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean, and there are no trains going there, she said Monday on Instagram. And since I don't fly because of the enormous climate impact of, let's see here, aviation is going to be a challenge. I haven't quite figured that out yet. And that's the end of the article. So, now most the pundits are going to fight this. Most pundits, they think that they're conservative, but they're really reactionary. And so what they will do is react to this. They will say, well, this is a bunch of BS, and that try to fight it. You know, say that either there is no climate change or that it isn't as severe as people say that it is, and cast doubt perhaps on the picture of the sled dogs standing in melted ice water, maybe counter it with by saying that the Antarctic ice sheet has been expanding for a number of years, etc., etc. The truly conservative way to approach this article is with questions, because if you fight this is what they're looking for. This is what the left is looking for. They're looking for resistance. They're looking for reaction, because it helps to create the movement. They can't have a movement without enemies. The left must have their enemies. The conspirators, the people that are trying to keep them from doing their good works. Now, and the reason I'm saying all this is because everything in this article is vague. It says Berlin, diplomats and climate experts gathered in Monday in Germany for UN-hosted talks on climate change, among growing public pressure for governments to act faster against global warming. So, who's that? What diplomats? What are you talking about? Ambassadors? Who? From where? Climate experts. Who are the climate experts? It's like they say, well, there's a consensus amongst scientists. Well, where is it? Let's see the paper in which all these scientists have signed off on global warming or climate change. Then there's climate change itself. UN-hosted talks on climate change. Well, what does that mean? Too much of the right, the usual pundits, they're going to, it's vague. It doesn't have any meaning. It's not defined. But the people on the right will try to assign a meaning to it so they can argue with it. The thing to do is to ask questions. Okay? True conservatives are open-minded. I have no qualms about making changes. Political changes, sociological changes, cultural changes, personal changes, if you can prove to me that there is an obvious case for those changes. That's why I ask questions. I'm open-minded. Okay, so climate change. What is it that's going to change? So the climate of Southern California, which is, by the way, there isn't a single climate in Southern California. There's microclimates. So the climate in the mountains is different than the climate at the beach, which is different than climate in the valleys. So let's just pretend Southern California has one climate. What does that mean when it's going to change? Is Southern California going to become a desert? Is all of Southern California going to become a rainforest? Is it going to become a savanna? And what about the savannas? What about the Brazilian rainforest? Is that going to change to something else? Is that going to become a Mediterranean climate? A desert climate? No answer to any of these questions. And until they answer these questions, I'm not on board. Okay? I make the presumption for the status quo. I say, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And when I look around, nothing looks like it's broke in terms of climate. I go outside and you see sunny or it's raining. We do have snow in Southern California in the mountains, by and large, and up in the Grapevine, not generally down in the valleys or in L.A. City, although it has snowed a couple of times. But generally speaking, no. So what does that mean for me as an individual, climate change? What is it I'm looking forward to? Is it going to be more rain, less rain? No answer. There's no answer to those. Right now, a lot of the politicians simply want to have it both ways. And they say that anything in the climate that seems unusual is pathological in nature and wrong and is a symbol of that or a result or a consequence of bad things done by humans. Greed, I suppose. Let me see. Officials meeting in the western city of Bonn for June 1727. Who are those officials? And again, we have a climate summit in Poland. Includes rules governing the international trade in carbon certificates, which allows rich countries to offset emissions by paying for projects in poor nations. So my question is, how does that work? How does that offset? What kind of project am I paying for in a poor nation that's going to offset my emissions? And what kind of emissions are we talking about? We're not talking about carbon dioxide, are we? Because one of the things I know with absolute certainty is that carbon dioxide is not and cannot be a greenhouse gas. So one of the things that you don't hear about anymore is the greenhouse effect. All this climate change, global warming stuff started with something known as the greenhouse effect, in which takes place 8 to 11 miles high in the sky, in what's known as the troposphere. And that's where certain chemicals get trapped. And they get trapped up there, and such as methane. And part of their job is to keep the heat that radiates off of the Earth from dissipating into space. If there weren't those chemicals up there, then this planet would be a lot colder than it really is. So say the scientists in theory. This greenhouse gas theory was first discovered, I think, in the 1800s, in the mid-1800s, and was validated a few years later. But again, the idea is that certain gases that rise, methane, will get trapped in the upper atmosphere and provide this warming effect for the planet. And then the left-wingers decided, this is a great thing where we can just say that we're putting too many of these gases in the air. We'll get too many of them up there. It will trap too much heat, and we will overheat. The oceans will rise, and all kinds of disasters will ensue, et cetera, et cetera. Fine. Then they go as far as to say, guess what? Carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas. Wrong. Absolutely wrong. Carbon dioxide is 1.5 times heavier than oxygen. Carbon dioxide travels along the ground. And if you don't think so, do an experiment. Get a balloon. Blow up the balloon. Tie it off and let it go. Does it go up or does it go down? Very often it'll hover for a little bit and then it'll drop down. But the point is it goes to the floor because it's full of what? Carbon dioxide. So carbon dioxide absolutely certainly is not and cannot be and never will be a greenhouse gas. So, but these are the things that the pundits should be doing, is spend more time questioning and less time automatically reacting. You look at these things when they talk about diplomats and climate experts, don't just automatically resist that. Ask yourself the question, who are these people? What are they talking about when they're talking about climate change? When somebody, your friends, your relatives, your coworkers come to you with climate change and all this other stuff, that's the way to handle it. I'm sorry, I don't understand. Well, what do you mean by climate change? What's going to happen precisely? And when is this supposed to happen? And what is it exactly we're supposed to do about it? The offset emissions, how is that supposed to help keep the planet cooler? And very often you're going to stymie the people on the left. They don't want to think about it. They don't want to analyze. They don't want to spend time studying. They don't want to win the argument. What they simply want to do is use power. They want to exert force on you and me and everyone else to get us to fall into line and do as we're told. And the most effective way that you can deal with that is by simply asking questions. So, because a lot of the claims that are made, especially in global warming, are arbitrary. You fight an arbitrary claim and you look like a guilty person trying to get away with something. If you want to look innocent, ask a question. That's what children do. Children are innocent. They ask questions like, how high is up? Daddy, how high is up? And it's cute. It's innocent. That's what you do when you're innocent. You don't protest your innocence. You ask questions. What are you talking about? What do you mean? That kind of thing. So when I come back, I'll be reading from The Reactionary Mind. Thank you very much. So when we left this yesterday, we were into a strike, a Seattle strike, and they were talking about strikes. And basically what he's getting into is the idea that conservatism has always been kind of reactionary and doing battle with the left, and that the essential battle between right and left is about power. It isn't. It's about change. But anyhow, he's drawing the conclusion, or trying to draw the conclusion, and supported that it's fundamentally about power. Who has it and who doesn't. And that those that don't have power, that are trying to get power, are a threat to conservatives, and that conservatives are generally the people that have power in various ways, shapes, and forms. So, back to the book. Into the 20th century, judges regularly denounced unionized workers for formulating their own definitions of rights and compiling their own register of shop floor rules. Workers like these, claimed one federal court, saw themselves as, quote, exponents of some higher law than that administered by courts, unquote. They were exercising, quote, powers belonging only to government, unquote, declared the Supreme Court, constituting themselves as a, quote, self-appointed tribunal, unquote, of law and order. Conservatism is a theoretical voice of this animus against the agency of the subordinate classes. It provides the most consistent and profound argument as to why the lower orders should not be allowed to exercise their independent will, why they should not be allowed to govern themselves or the polity. Submission is their first duty, agency, the prerogative of the elite. Though it is often claimed that the left stands for equality while the right stands for freedom, this notion misstates the actual disagreement between right and left. Historically, the conservatives favored liberty for the higher orders and constraint for the lower orders. What the conservative sees and dislikes in equality, in other words, is not a threat to freedom, but its extension. For in that extension, he sees a loss of his own freedom. Quote, we are all agreed as to our own liberty, unquote, declared Samuel Johnson. Quote, but we are not agreed as to the liberty of others, for in proportion as we take, others must lose. I believe we hardly wish that the mob should have liberty to govern us, unquote. Such was the threat Edmund Burke saw in the French Revolution, not merely an expropriation of property or an explosion of violence, but an inversion of the obligations of deference and command. Quote, the levelers, he claimed, unquote, quote, only change and pervert the natural order of things, unquote. So right here, before I forget, I want to say is that, again, what really the author is making, demonstrating or describing is really not the behavior of conservatives at all, but the behavior of traditionalists and traditionalism. Back to the book, quote, the occupation of a hairdresser or of a working tallow chandler cannot be a matter of honor to any person, to say nothing of a number of the other more servile employments. Such descriptions of men ought not suffer oppression from the state, but the state suffers oppression if such as they, either individually or collectively, are permitted to rule, unquote. By virtue of membership in a polity, Burke argued, men had a great many rights to the fruits of their labor, their inheritance, education, and more, but the one right he refused to concede to all men was that, quote, share of power, authority, and direction, unquote, they might think they ought to have, quote, in the management of the state, unquote. Even when the left's demands shift to the economic realm, the threat of freedom's extension looms large. If women and workers are provided with the economic resources to make independent choices, they will be free not to obey their husbands and employers. That is why Lawrence Mead, one of the leading intellectual opponents of the welfare state in the 80s and 90s, declared that the welfare recipient, quote, must be made less free in certain senses rather than more, unquote. For the conservative, equality portends more than a redistribution of resources, opportunities, and outcomes, though he certainly dislikes these too. What equality ultimately means is a rotation in the seat of power. The conservative's not wrong to continue or construe the threat of the left in these terms. Before he died, G.A. Cohen, one of the contemporary Marxism's most acute voices, made the case that much of the left's program of economic redistribution could be understood as entailing not a sacrifice of freedom for the sake of equality, but an extension of freedom from the few to the many. And, indeed, the great modern movements of emancipation, from abolition to feminism to the struggle for workers' rights and civil rights, have always posited a nexus between freedom and equality. Marching out of the family, the factory, and the field, where unfreedom and inequality are the flip sides of the same coin, they have made freedom and equality the irreducible yet mutually reinforcing parts of a single whole. The link between freedom and equality has not made the argument for redistribution any more palatable to the right. As one conservative wag complained of John Dewey's vision of social democracy, quote, the definitions of liberty and of equality have been juggled that both refer to approximately the same condition, unquote. Far from being a sleight of the progressive hand, however, this synthesis of freedom and equality is a central postulate of the politics of emancipation. Whether the politics conforms to the postulate is, of course, another story. But for the conservative, the concern is less a betrayal of the postulate than its fulfillment. So, again, the idea that expanding freedom, expanding power in particular is the issue between left and right. It really has nothing to do with it. It has to do with change, ultimately. Where do you stand on change? Do you simply make the presumption for the status quo, or do you make the presumption for change? Do you get up in the morning thinking everything sucks and it therefore has to change, or do you get up and say, you know what, things are pretty damn good? We'll change when there's an obvious case for change. And those are the two ways. The former is the way a socialist looks at things, and the latter is the way a conservative looks at things. A reactionary / traditionalist would get up and say, what is the left up to? What is the left doing? What are they trying to get away with? And let's put a stop to it. So those are the differences there. Back in a minute. Thank you. And There we go. Bullies, how the left's culture of fear and intimidation silences Americans. And yesterday we were on the, who was bullying yesterday? It was the, let's see, university. The university bullies was yesterday. Today, Hollywood bullies. Hollywood is a liberal industry and everyone knows it. Hollywood is full of bullies and everyone knows it. Only in Hollywood are bullies like Harvey Weinstein, who reportedly is one of the nastiest people in Hollywood, a man who once headlocked and dragged New York Observer reporter Andrew Goldman out of an event, threatened to beat the S out of director Julie Taymor's dinner companion, and told Democratic politico Terry McAuliffe, "You mother effer, I'll rip your balls off." Able to hypocritically produce movies like Bully, and then, of course, bully the ratings board to change the rating from R to PG-13. Bullying in Hollywood is ubiquitous. It's ubiquitous from people like Barbra Streisand, who thinks it's ideological fascism to replace Robert Scheer with Jonah Goldberg in the pages of the Los Angeles Times, but demands that members of the servant class elevate her bed a specific number of degrees in hotels and recarpet her bedroom. Mariah Carey, requires an attendant to discard her gum. Michael Moore demands an enormous hock of ham, a beanbag filled with Jell-O, and a whoopee cushion with George W. Bush's face. Okay, that last example isn't real, but the other ones are. Nobody treats people worse than the biggest stars in Hollywood. Personally, they're bullies. But ideologically, they're even bigger bullies. These stars all live in beautiful homes off Sunset Boulevard, ensconced behind walls of leaves and enormous staffs of personal attendants. They walk into bars in New York City, leave them looking like outtakes from a Bosnian documentary, and never get prosecuted. They get married, divorced, again, married, go to drug rehab, get divorced, get married, and then finally announce they're gay to the applause of the mainstream media. It's a great life. Hollywood routinely discriminates against people who refuse to be bullied, as many top-level Hollywood executives, writers, and producers admitted to me. If you're a conservative in Hollywood, you stay underground for fear of firing. If you happen to have voted for California's Proposition 8 upholding traditional marriage, you keep that buried behind NSA-level security. The moment your peers find out, you're out of a job. As Nicholas Meyer, director of The Day After, as well as writer of Star Trek 2, 4, and 6, told me when asked about discrimination in Hollywood, quote, "Well, I hope so," unquote. Or as Vin DeBona, producer of MacGyver and America's Funniest Home Videos, explained to me, quote, "I think it's probably accurate that there's anti-conservative discrimination, and I'm happy about it, actually. If the accusation is there, I'm okay with it," unquote. The point? Only liberal content will be produced if liberals can bully conservatives out of the industry. The Hollywood crowd engages with the political and media crowd on a regular basis, crafting narrative for the left. It's no surprise that President Obama and his regulatory friends have gone out of their way to focus on issues near and dear to Hollywood. They're his palace guard, bullying on his behalf and doing it to tremendous effect. And that was Hollywood Bullies from the book Bullies by Mr. Goldberg, How the Left's Culture of Fear and Intimidation Silences Americans. So, back in a second. Well, thank you. And so the way to attaboy or way to go Donald Trump section is, let me see, we got on Twitter here, what did he say? The story in the New York Times about the U.S. escalating attacks on Russia's power grid is fake news. And the failing New York Times knows it. They should immediately release their sources, which, if they exist at all, which I doubt, are phony. Times must be held fully accountable. A couple things about this. Number one is the whole, he's absolutely right about that they should be held accountable both for bad news stories, but also all news agencies must be held accountable for peekaboo news, playing peekaboo with the truth by using unnamed sources. No newspaper or and any news agency should be allowed to get away with that. Every news agency should be publishing only those stories that are fully sourced, that are using sources that are willing to go on the record. And if you don't have that, then you shouldn't be publishing it. So, way to go, Donald Trump. You wouldn't hear this from George Bush. You wouldn't hear it from Reagan. You wouldn't hear it from Clinton. You wouldn't hear this from any other president of the United States. This is one of the things I like about President Trump. Sometimes, I think he could word things. I know he could word things better. But I like the fact that he communicates more like a real person. That's what this country's about. Anybody can be president of the United States. And Donald Trump is proof of that, with the way, especially with the way he communicates on Twitter. You don't have to be a political hack. You don't have to start as a dog catcher, work your way up through the system to become president of the United States. You can come out of nowhere and end up being president of the United States. And you don't always have to talk out of both sides of your mouth once you enter office. You can talk plainly, you can communicate clearly, and communicate in a style that the average person can understand. So, and relate to. So, where are we at here? Okay. So, who are the true conservatives? They are the people that understand that conservatism is a lifestyle. They're patriotic people who use common sense. They make judgments instead of predictions, speak clearly and definitively, and are not afraid to say no. They are open-minded, asking why rather than why not. They are consistent, credible, and influential, not ashamed of their existence, unafraid to learn or correct their mistakes. They are normal Americans. And that brings me to the conclusion of another episode of The Drill. And until next time, thank you very much for listening, and have a great day.